Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another Jane Austen July video. And this is going to be all about the romantic poets in Jane Austen's novels. And I decided to kind of make this very simple and hopefully very quick, that I would really hone in on only 3 of her novels. So today we're going to be talking about Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, of course, and also Mansfield Park, which is a personal favorite of mine. I've been thinking about making a video on this topic since last Jane Austen July when I read Persuasion for the first time. Persuasion was my last Jane Austen novel to read, and when I read it, I was really shocked at kind of the blatant discussion of romantic poetry in it. There's a really big scene where a couple of characters discuss Sir Walter Scott and Lord Byron and kind of the good and bad of each, whether one is superior to the other. And so I got really curious about Jane Austen's relationship with the poetry of her time. And so for the past year, I've kind of been ruminating on this, particularly in regards to Persuasion. But since I am right now currently rereading Mansfield Park, it also really stuck out to me there. And so I decided that maybe I should hone in on just a few of the novels this time. Maybe next time I can hone in on very specific instances if I decide that I want to do this again. But I think the 3 books that I'm going to talk about today discuss romantic poetry to the most blatant degree. It really shows up pretty blatantly here, and I think it has a bit of an impact on the story, actually. Now, when I was doing research for this earlier, I did come across a book called Jane Austen and the Romantics, I believe, and this is kind of a scholarly work, and so I was able to read part of it on JSTOR, and I think it's really, really interesting. This book is not actually going for kind of the thing that I wanted to go for with this video. He is more interested in this book in kind of linking the themes of Romanticism into Jane Austen's novels, kind of looking at themes from very specific instances in the novels and how that reflects kind of the romantic attitudes of the time, how romantic poetry is reflected in Jane Austen's novels. And he really, in particular, wanted to look at Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. And Emma was an interesting one, and I kind of wanted to include that here, but I decided not to because I think Sense and Sensibility is a really, really interesting one from this perspective. But let's get into this. Because I'm only going to discuss 3 novels, I'm also only going to discuss 3 poets. And really the reasoning for that is that 3 poets are the main romantic poets that Jane Austen references throughout not just these novels, but all of her novels in particular, throughout her letters. I did some research on the things that she was kind of writing down, that she made note of in her letters and her journals, and so these 3 popped out. So we'll talk a little bit about Wordsworth, we'll talk about Sir Walter Scott, and then we'll also talk about Lord Byron. Coleridge could also have been pulled in here because I think at times it's hard to determine when Wordsworth ends and Coleridge begins because there was a lot of overlap in their career and a lot of collaboration on work. But I decided, because I've been trying to read a lot of William Wordsworth this month, he would be the one that I would like to focus on because I do feel like I understand him a little bit more than I do Coleridge at this point. As regarding other romantic poets, interestingly enough, when I was doing research for this, William Blake is one that Jane Austen would apparently have not been familiar with at all. And then around the time of her death is really when Shelley and Keats's careers were kicking off. Now, Shelley had been active for a very long time, but he actually gained more in popularity later in his life and actually after his death. So Jane was probably not all that familiar with Percy, and she certainly would not have been with Mary Shelley or any of the other novelists, Peacock, Hogg, things like that. I think she really would have stuck to poetry. Now, the interesting thing is, the version of these romantic poets that she knew are not actually the versions that I think we look back on. So just to give you context for this, at this point in time, and I'm talking mainly around 1816, 1817, when the writing of Persuasion was happening, Lord Byron at this point is mostly known for writing truly romance poetry, truly romantic poetry. He's known for Childe Harold. He's known for the Turkish romances. He at this point is not known for being kind of comedic. He's not known for those comic epics that come later on in his career. Sir Walter Scott is actually more known at this point for his poetry than for his novels. We look back on Sir Walter Scott pretty famously as kind of bringing in historical fiction as a genre. At this point, he's only written 3 novels, and so he's actually mostly known for his verse. William Wordsworth at this time has been around the longest, and he certainly probably had the most successful career, but he hasn't actually written the Prelude yet. The Prelude might be William Wordsworth's most famous work other than lyrical ballads, and the Prelude had not yet been published at this point in time. So this is the context for what Jane Austen would have been reading and what she would have been talking about personally and in her novels. Now, did she like them? I really can't comment on that. There are definitely moments that I've seen from reading parts of her letters that makes me think she finds this stuff a little bit sappy, or she finds it a little bit sentimental. But on the other hand, I certainly saw instances where, in particular with Sir Walter Scott, that I think she kind of begrudgingly liked it. Marmion is one that her brother wrote down that she really struggled with, but years on, she actually was constantly making reference to Marmion, and it actually influenced her picking up Waverley, I think. And she said she did not want to like Waverley, but she thought she would have to concede that it was probably a very good novel. So I do think she probably liked Sir Walter Scott. She also probably liked Lord Byron. I believe she read The Corsair, I think it was. She read within a couple of weeks of its publication. So it kind of seems to me that she liked him. Why else would you pick something up almost immediately upon publication? But we're really not here to talk about Jane's relationship with the poets. That could be an entirely different video, which I think would be really interesting, but I would really have to commit to reading her letters and reading her journals for that. But let's get into romantic poetry in her novels. The first one that we're going to talk about, I actually am going to get into theme a little bit with. And so I do think in this instance, themes of the Romantic movement show up pretty prominently in this novel, and that is Sense and Sensibility. Now, Sense and Sensibility is one of Jane Austen's earlier written works, and I think you can tell that. I think a lot of people think it's probably pretty weak because of that, especially in terms of her writing, because we're also going to discuss Persuasion in this video, which is her last written work, and most people would say is probably her most mature. But I have a real fondness for Sense and Sensibility, and I used to rank it as my least favorite of her books. But upon reflection, really over the past year, Sense and Sensibility has crept up on me, and I found myself thinking about it far more than some of her other works. And a lot of that comes down to the character of Marianne, in my opinion, who I know a lot of people think of as silly and as really foolish, and a lot of people actually really hate Marianne. But I have a strange fondness for her, and I feel as though she's almost a kindred spirit to me. So Sense and Sensibility focuses on 2 sisters, one of which is Eleanor Dashwood, and she is certainly the sensible one. But Marianne, the younger sister, is very passionate, and that's kind of what she's looking for. She's looking for a passionate relationship. She's looking for somebody who will indulge her love of art, of music, and of poetry. And so I think the ideals of the Romantic movement come to the forefront of Sense and Sensibility in a way that they don't in some of Jane Austen's other novels, because it's interesting to think that Jane Austen, especially early on, she started out mimicking other writers, and she also started out by commenting on other writers, by kind of creating satire of other popular works. And so we have things like Lady Susan that I think calls back to Evelina by Frances Burney. We have Northanger Abbey, which does really call into the Gothic tradition and reflects back on Anne Radcliffe, maybe The Monk by Matthew Lewis, things like that. I think Sense and Sensibility is commenting on lyrical ballads. I think that's kind of the work that it's going in conversation with a little bit. And I might be going out on a limb here, because I actually have not finished Lyrical Ballads. I've read part of Lyrical Ballads, but this was groundbreaking. This is one of the biggest works of the Romantic movement. It was co-written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. And a lot of Lyrical Ballads surrounds nature. And nature is what really shows up in Sense and Sensibility for me. I think it is the work of Jane Austen's that is most in conversation with nature. The house that the Dashwoods moved to, the countryside that they're located in, that is almost a character in its own right. But I think there's also really interesting conversations about nature. The Dashwoods spend a lot of time outdoors. That's where a lot of big scenes happen. So on one level, we have the plot, and on the next, we have the setting, we have the weather. And as you can hear, we're about to have some weather here. I think it's going to become a thunderstorm really soon, so I'm sorry if you can hear that if it gets really dark. But it's very atmospheric because a big scene happens in the rain. Actually, a couple of big scenes happen in the rain in Sense and Sensibility. And those scenes revolve around the character of Marianne. And I think Marianne as a character really reflects the romantic ideals very well. She is somebody who's very passionate, who's very sentimental, who really wants to get lost in language, lost in music. And she's also really interested in spending a lot of time in nature. So on a thematic level, I think Sense and Sensibility is the one that interacts with the themes of the Romantic movement the most blatantly. And in true Jane Austen fashion, there is also satire of these big themes of the Romantic movement, because Marianne is also kind of disparaged for her obsession with poetry, with passion, for thinking that's the most important thing and that's the thing you should make your decision about regarding a relationship. She's viewed as very silly for that and maybe a little bit out of touch. And there's also a scene with Edward Ferrars in Sense and Sensibility where they're kind of talking about nature, they're talking about trees, and Marianne, of course, prefers this kind of wild, unfurled nature, gnarled trees, weeping willows type of thing. And Edward Ferrars remarks that he prefers when trees are uniform, and that's when they are at the most beautiful, is when they are all in a line, they are all perfectly straight, and when they are all perfectly groomed. And so that is where kind of the difference of opinion comes in between the sensible side of Sense and Sensibility and the more romantic side of Marianne. Every time I dig into Sense and Sensibility like this, I love it just a little bit more. So maybe this is the next Jane Austen book that I should reread. Okay, let's move on to Mansfield Park, which is one of my favorite Jane Austen novels. I love Mansfield Park. And this is a very internal novel. This is a novel that feels very character-driven, that feels very introspective, and it is historically the novel of Jane Austen's that people struggle with the most. I think a lot of people will rank Mansfield Park at the bottom of their list because it is a fairly slow and very internal book where the main character doesn't really get much opportunity to shine in terms of plot development. She's somebody who kind of stands to the side while other characters are actually doing things. And so it is a book that a lot of readers struggle with. But I really find the pacing and the tone of Mansfield Park, I find it very refreshing. And I also just really enjoy it. I really enjoy spending time at Mansfield Park. And so this is another one where setting does kind of come into it. Mansfield Park as a place does feel very important in the narrative. But in terms of romantic themes, this one is maybe not quite as blatant as Sense and Sensibility. But the main character, Fanny Price, is definitely a fan of literature. She's definitely a fan of poetry. And one of the most interesting scenes in Mansfield Park to me is when Fanny is kind of reflecting on the East Room, which is a room in Mansfield Park that she has spent a lot of time in. It is very personal to her. And she makes an allusion to Tintern Abbey, which is a poem by William Wordsworth. And it's so interesting how similar that scene of her kind of reflecting on her experience with the East Room is to William Wordsworth's relationship with Tintern Abbey in that poem. Tintern Abbey has also become a very personal place, a very solitary place for the poet, which is exactly the same as the East Room is for Fanny. And so Fanny even says in this scene that she used to kind of create a fake world here. She used to imagine these inanimate objects coming to life, creating friends for herself because she was such a lonely child. And that is a theme that actually shows up in Tintern Abbey. And so I think Jane Austen clearly was really going for a true illusion here, because Fanny's imagination kind of populating a scene in the East Room, it really goes alongside the poet of Tintern Abbey kind of populating a scene of this desolate place, which I think is really fascinating, and I think does show that probably Jane Austen had a real appreciation for William Wordsworth. And William Wordsworth is definitely the Romantic poet that she couldn't have ignored. William Wordsworth was massively popular at this time. He was really prolific. He'd written quite a bit, and he was still going. So this is one she absolutely could not escape. She definitely had to have read quite a bit of William Wordsworth at the time. And so he pops up here in this really interesting scene. But Sir Walter Scott also makes his appearance in Mansfield Park because Fanny will make reference to specifically The Lay of the Last Minstrel, I believe, which is a longer narrative poem that was written by Sir Walter Scott. And so you can definitely see that with all of these allusions to poetry, that Fanny is somebody who reads quite a bit. And she's also someone who really lets the atmosphere of the reading inform her opinions, because she's visiting a new house, actually, when she makes reference to Lay of the Last Minstrel, and she says, this is nowhere like the Lay of the Last Minstrel, this kind of mythical, really beautiful old place, and she is really looking for that. She's looking for that in this big grand house, and she doesn't see it, and so she kind of lets her reading inform her in a similar way to Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, and that could also be its own entire video. I think these are qualities that really make Fanny relatable to me personally as a character. And I also really appreciate that the poetry that Fanny is referencing, the poetry that Fanny clearly really enjoys reading and draws parallels with to her own life, is a very kind of solitary, almost sad poetry. And I think that also adds depth to her character, because it kind of gives you an insight into how Fanny feels. Fanny does feel isolated. Fanny does feel alone. So it does make sense that these are poems that would probably stick out to her, because not only were they popular at the time this was written, but they are also something very personal to her. And with me personally, I have found that's what I really enjoy about the Romantic poets thus far, is that I do feel as though the poetry they write feels incredibly personal to me. Some of the poems are really moving, because it does feel as though they are reflecting a true emotion, and they are reflecting something that I feel today, let alone something that I would have felt had I lived at the time in which they were written. So I think that kind of speaks to the Romantic poets and their popularity and kind of their timelessness in that regard. Last but not least, let's discuss Persuasion, which has maybe the most obvious references to Romantic poets in it. So there is a really big scene in Persuasion where they discuss Sir Walter Scott and Lord Byron. And this is between the main character, Anne Elliot, and a character called Benwick. And the context for Benwick is that he has lost his wife, and he is really stuck in his grief. And he is reading incredibly sad poetry to essentially allow him to continue to wallow in his grief. And the narrative does not really cut him slack for that. The narrative kind of wants you to think that he's almost a little bit ingenuine, or that he's gone too far with this. And so you might want to read his opinions on the poets Scott and Byron. You might want to read that as Jane Austen kind of disparaging them as being sentimental, because they are something that Benwick would enjoy. But I tend to think that there is a little bit more of a genuine quality here with Benwick. I actually really feel for Benwick in Persuasion, and some people don't like him at all, which I think is really interesting. But I think I probably really jived with Benwick because clearly he was really into the Romantic poets. So specifically, there was discussion of Lord Byron's Turkish romances, so the Giaour, the Corsair, etc. And then we also had discussion of Sir Walter Scott's Marmion and the Lady of the Lake. These are really interesting poems to talk about, specifically from Benwick's perspective and also from Anne's, because there is a real sense of grief throughout this novel, I would say the tone of Persuasion is actually rather sad. It's rather melancholy. I really, really like that because I love this kind of conversation around missed opportunities, missed chances. So every character in the book really feels as though they've gone through something, and they feel as though they are also grieving something to the same degree that Benwick is. A major theme of Lord Byron's Turkish tales is actually kind of survival. I do have a video where I discussed the Giaour at some length, and I will link to that up above, and that is all about the Romantics and vampires. So the Giaour does actually feature a character that becomes a vampire. And towards the end of the Giaour, and actually even the Corsair, this is actually a little bit of a theme for many of the Turkish tales now that I'm thinking about it. And at the end, the only thing that has survived is the story of the characters, is this poem about the characters, if that makes sense. And so I think it's a really interesting poem for them to be discussing because there is quite a bit of sadness and grief in the Giaour in particular, but there is also a real sense of kind of hopefulness that even when you die, story will live on. Marmion and the Lady of the Lake also have a real melancholy quality. The Lady of the Lake in particular does, which I really, really enjoy. I've said before and I'll say again, melancholy is one of my favorite tones for literature, for media of any kind, because I do think it's really introspective, and I think it requires you to have a lot of reflection personally, because why is it melancholy to you? It may not be melancholy to somebody else, and other people may very well find Persuasion to be an uplifting book, but I really don't. I think the whole tone of Persuasion is rather sad, and so I think the discussion of these four poems in particular talks about a wider theme in Persuasion, really, which is this discussion of grief, this discussion of what does survive. And maybe Benwick isn't really genuine in his grief. Maybe he's been wallowing in it too long. Maybe we, as the readers, are not actually supposed to take him seriously as a character. Maybe we're not supposed to like him. But I actually really do, and I love everything that he has to say about the Romantics. But again, this characterization of Benwick kind of calls back to the characterization of Marianne as kind of being overly emotional, as looking for the wrong thing. And so again, I kind of wonder how Jane Austen really interacted with the Romantics and the Romantic movement, how she really felt about the broader themes, because this is two cases where I think characters are shamed a bit for being a little bit overly sentimental or overly emotional. Persuasion is a really interesting one, and it's one that I would like to dig deeper into, particularly from this romantic perspective. But those are just three instances that I have observed where Jane Austen is kind of in conversation with the Romantic poets, where she's quoted from them. And I do think that there is kind of a thematic relationship between these works and the Romantic movement. It's really interesting to think about current literature that was written at the same time that maybe your favorite classic author was writing, because nobody really works in a bubble. Your current times do have a real effect on you as an artist, in my opinion. And so this has been a really interesting Jane Austen July for me, because I have been trying to read works that were published at the same time that she was living. So it's been interesting to think that I am, first of all, reading a work that she probably would have read. But it's also interesting to wonder what her opinions of these things were. So that's just a taste of Jane Austen and the Romantics, and I probably could have gone on for 2 or 3 hours. I would love to know if you have observed kind of a relationship between the Romantic poets and Jane Austen, and I would also love to know how your Jane Austen July is going down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.